Ehud is found in Judges chapter 3 from verse 12. And we'll just look at Ehud, not Othniel. We saw that King Eglon is described in verse 17 as a very fat man. Now, in cultures where there is a lot of poverty, unlike ours, unlike most of the Western world, fatness is actually a sign of wealth. So at this point, the original readers may not have been laughing like we might. In Pakistan, occasionally someone would say to us, "You look very healthy," and that means you'd put on a bit of weight, and that was meant to be a compliment, sort of. Now we come to Ehud, and we saw well described in the video as a Benjaminite and a left-handed man in verse 15. And we saw the word Benjamin means a son of the right hand. We might think of the right-hand man. The son of the right hand is left-handed, not necessarily his father's pride and joy, at least in his hand, the use of his hands. Again, when we lived in Pakistan and we were learning language, and we discovered the word for left-handed, when we put the words together, it almost sounded like upside down hand, or not quite right hand, or the bad hand, or the wrong hand. And when I kind of saw the Hebrew word, it looked like fairly similar. In many cultures today, including Pakistan, people don't use their left hand for important things, and to hand someone something with your left hand can be a deliberate insult. Now, one reason is that we were told that in those countries, instead of using toilet paper, they use water and their left hand. They obviously don't have the same problems as we have had in COVID and long queues and shortage of toilet paper. Well, if that is all correct, then we see the humour and the strange choice in Ehud, the left-handed man. It may also mean that the word is not 100% clear. It could mean that he was ambidextrous, that he actually bound his right hand so that to strengthen his left hand. In that case, he is a trained assassin and also an unlikely choice for God to use, and perhaps not very popular in his culture. Well, if his right hand was bound or mangled, then King Eglon would not have found him very threatening. So let's assume he looks quite innocent and harmless, but yet he's quite cunning. And as Jocelyn told us, he fashioned for himself the double-edged sword and he strapped it to his thigh under his clothing. They probably, the men had maybe more like dresses, maybe like the Scottish people or something, so it was easy to grab it with his left hand from his right side. So Ehud goes and he presents the tribute to Eglon. He wins Eglon's confidence. Then he leaves, or he pretends to leave. He gets as far as the idols, probably on the outskirts of town, and then, it's a feint almost, and then he turns back. He sends away the porters who helped him bring all the food. The tribute was likely food, and because he wants a private audience with King Eglon. He cunningly arouses the curiosity of the king with the promise of a juicy secret. Don't we all love a juicy secret? And maybe the implication was he got it when he was there at the place of idols where he turned back. The king naively and foolishly sends out all of his security, so it's just the two of them. And we kind of meant to see how stupid he is. And then Ehud says he has a message, or actually, I've got a thing for you, Eglon. I have something from God for you, is what he says. And that causes the king to stand up, maybe in respect or leaning over to listen better, to receive God's message. And he does indeed receive God's message. He presents, as he stands up, a prime target, his big fat belly, for the left-handed assassin Ehud. Now, this doesn't happen in slow motion, but the writer, as it were, gives us a slow motion blow by blow or sword thrust account in all its gruesome M-rated detail. Ehud takes his famous left hand to his right thigh. He gets the sword to deliver the message from God, which is a thrust into the big fat belly of Eglon. Eglon is so fat that the fat folds over the hilt of the sword, and you can't even see the sword anymore. And Ehud just leaves it there. We're even given some extra gratuitous but kind of important detail. In verse 22, the dung comes out. Now, Eglon's name, ironically, means little bull. He's not quite so little. He's been fattened on the back of the labour of God's people, all the food they sent to him as tribute. The fattened calf has now been slaughtered or sacrificed for and by God's people to God. Ehud makes his escape and he locks the doors behind him. And then we have the next scene, the servants. They wonder what Eglon is up to. He's taking a long time. They haven't seen him for a while. There's a bit of a smell coming from the locked room, but there is a toilet there. Maybe they've smelt it before. And so maybe they weren't too worried. Maybe the king was having some problems. They would have known not to disturb the king at that particular time when he's sitting on the loo. Verse 25 says they waited for the king until they were embarrassed. Now, when we were living in Pakistan, I think it was, we actually had a visitor who locked themselves in the bathroom, and they were a bit too embarrassed, I think, to call out, and we were probably a bit too embarrassed to find out what happened. And after a while, I'm not sure if it was quite half an hour, we finally worked it out and managed to let them out. Well, the servants, duty kind of trumps embarrassment, I guess. They get their keys out, they unlock the toilet door, and there is their Lord in all his splendour, dead on the floor, surrounded by all the stuff that had leaked out from his body. That part is left to our imagination. Meanwhile, Ehud has had plenty of time to escape. He gets back to the idols, he keeps going, he calls the Israelites to war, and he appropriately gives the honour to God. In verse 28, he says, "The Lord has given your enemies into your hand." In verse 29, it describes, one last thing in this story, double meaning if you like, it describes the Moabites who were killed. In our English Bible, it has words like strong, able-bodied, but those words could also mean stout and fat, healthy, fairly large, and maybe that's why the Israelites found it so easy to catch them. And so Israel wins the day, or actually God wins the day for his people using Ehud, the left-handed man. Well, that's the story, and there's some entertainment for us there, and it's intended to be there. But why is this story in the Bible, you might be asking yourself, and I've been asking myself that this week as I've been reading it. What does it teach about God? What does it teach us about ourselves? And how are we meant to respond? Well, firstly, we see the incredible variety of God's word. Did you know this was in the Bible? It's not what we might expect. The Bible constantly surprises us if we allow it to, if we read it in all its breadth and depth. The Bible allows us and encourages us to laugh at times, and don't we need a good laugh in these days? We don't always have to adapt a quiet, meditative, reverent tone when we respond to the Bible. Sometimes we can laugh out loud, or we might cry, or we can have all kinds of different reactions to the Bible, and we're meant to. It's that kind of book. It's diverse in its literature. Sometimes we might have to think hard, and sometimes we might just scratch our head and wonder what is going on here. And that's what I've been doing much of this week. The Bible is not always black and white. It embraces the complexities and especially the darkness of this world and shows it, reflects it to us. It doesn't hide it or pretend it's not there. And while sin and evil and all the stuff that goes on in Judges and it's going on in our world today is no laughing matter, perhaps we do need a bit of light, or just a bit of light relief in such a dark book. And perhaps almost deceptively, like Ehud, the humour kind of gets under our defences and challenges us with God's message. Maybe that's what's going on. Well, we weren't looking. God has crept in and challenged us as we kind of sober for a moment and think, oh, yes. Let's continue and see what we see. There is a danger that we only read the comfortable and safe parts of the Bible. That's easy to do. That's what I like to do. The bits that we agree with, we understand. The bits that don't challenge us and make us feel uncomfortable. In Judges, we see the Bible can be outrageous. It can be controversial. It can be surprising and confusing, but never boring. When we do skip the hard parts, we miss the incredible variety and the depth and the breadth of God's words to us and the balance that's there as well. One way not to make this mistake is to read the Bible all the way through. Then you don't miss any of it, and try and do that regularly. Or you might deliberately choose bits that you've never read before, or you've rarely read or don't understand very well, that you know are going to give you a bit of a challenge. And we've got a bit of time in COVID, haven't we? There's a good way to use your time. Mix up your reading with different parts of the Bible, from different parts and different kinds. And if you read the Bible all the way through, from beginning to end, that will kind of happen a bit, or you can do the mixing yourself. There are plenty of Bible reading plans if you need one. The other thing to do is when you read, try and read as much as you can, the whole book, or at least the whole chapter, because then you get a larger context than just picking a verse from here and a verse from there. That kind of makes us feel good. If you read a chapter every day, you get through the whole Bible in around about 3 years. If you read 3 or 4 chapters a day, then you get through the Bible in a year. It's a good habit to try and get into, to read the Bible in a year. There's even a 90-day Bible reading plan. I've tried that once or twice. I think I've done it once, maybe. Anyway, let's move on. What do we actually learn from this? The first thing is that God wins. We've learned a few things about the literature of the Bible and the importance of reading the Bible and all of the Bible, different parts, the hard parts. Now we learn some things about God. The stories in Judges are very human stories, and they teach us much about ourselves, but the Bible stories always teach us about God, and that can be a question that's easy to forget to ask. And that question is, what does the Bible teach us about God? What does this story teach us about God? Here, the message I think is obvious, but it's worth saying that God always wins. And the reason I think it's worth saying and repeating is because we often forget. I know that I often forget. We need to remember that God always wins when we're going through hard times, especially at the moment. The battle against COVID is one that God will win. The suffering of COVID does have an end. And it feels like we're being tortured as it looks like we get to the end and then it extends further. It will come to an end. We don't know how or we don't know when, but we do know that God is in control. Here we see him in control of human affairs, but we also know that God is in control of the whole world. We need to pray, we need to plead with God for it to stop, and then wait patiently for him in his good time to bring it to an end. We also need to remember that God always wins when we're tempted to go against God. And this story tells us it's a foolish thing to do, to go against God. But how often do we try and do it? And even God's people, not just the enemies, go against God over and over again. Even the leaders who are supposedly good go against God. And we kind of see Judges holds up a mirror and we actually get to see ourselves, maybe a little bit distorted, but the mistakes they made, their disobedience, in the end, if we think about it, isn't too much different from the way that we treat God from time to time. You see, we We normally prefer to see sin a bit more subtly disguised, but here in Judges we just see it so clear. And it doesn't try and dress it up or make it more respectable like we do. It just shows us sin in all its ugliness, and that's helpful for us to see. God wins, so do trust him and don't try to fight him. Another thing we learn is that God wins. When he wins, he uses weak and sinful human beings like you and like me. Here in Judges, they're called deliverers or judges. And as we see most clearly in Ehud, they're not the kind of people that we would expect. And that's why when you look in the mirror, you can't say that God can't use that person who's looking back at you. If God can use Ehud, then surely he can use you. Surely he can use me. And God, for his own reasons, often seems to bypass the very good standards for leaders. It doesn't give us an excuse to do the same, but it does tell us that God uses surprising people and can use us in all of our weakness. It also tells us that we don't have to get ourselves clean before we come to God, before God can use us. God calls us to come just as we are, like the Billy Graham song, just as I am. And then God uses us and changes us and purifies us. Even though it's hard to see, that's what God is doing, even in Judges, purifying his people. And sometimes it's a very difficult process. But that's God's project with you and with me, with his people, always making them more like himself. When God wins, he puts down tyrants like Eglon. This is our last point. The humour in the story makes us laugh at big fat Eglon. But for 18 long years, Eglon oppressed God's people. That was no laughing matter. That would have been hugely difficult. Many people would have died in that 18 years not having seen the victory that God would have brought through Ehud. Maybe many people died under the hand of Eglon and his soldiers. God's victory was coming. We can look back and we can see it. But at that time, they didn't know if it would come or when it would come. Only those who trusted God knew that it would come one day. In Psalm 2, it talks about those who oppose God and his anointed leader. In verse 4, it says, he who sits in heaven, that is God, laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. The Lord laughs at tyrants, and one day he will just flick them away. And sometimes in quite a spectacular way. God always brings down tyrants, and he holds them to account. We don't always see when and how, but God calls us to trust that he will do it, even when we can't see that, even when it looks like it will never happen. Last thing I want to say as we think about this is that your response might be, well, why does God allow suffering in the first place, and evil and injustice and war and tyrants like Eglon? Judges doesn't give us the answer that we might like or find comfortable, but I think Judges shows us what happens when we ignore God and shows us why that is such a bad idea. It shows us a part of the world and a part of history in all its dark and grisly and godless and sinful detail, in a hope that we will learn from it and want to avoid it and turn to God and not make the mistakes that they made. Judges shows us what happens when God's people stray far from him. To stray from God is the height of foolishness. That's the point. To stray from God is to stray from the source of blessing, the source of joy and peace, the source of all that is good. Can't we see that? And so often we don't. I don't. They, no doubt, and I'm sure you, thought that it was more fun to follow idols or whatever today it might be for us and to follow God. I'm sure they had lots of good reasons for turning their back on God as people do today. I'm sure they didn't do it just for the fun of it. They obviously thought that they didn't need God. They may well have been pursuing what they thought. Well, they would have been what they thought would make them happy and fulfilled, as so many people do today. Just look around you. That's what people do. They think, obviously, and so often it's more fun to do that than to follow God, than to come to church, to watch church online. But where did it get them? Just read the last few chapters of Judges to find out. Just read the story of Ehud to find out. But the other thing that Judges shows us is that God doesn't give up on his people, even when we do turn our back on him. No matter how far we stray from him, God is always chasing and bringing us back. God does allow them to face the consequences of their actions, of their sin. But again and again, God stops short of letting them feel the full consequences of their action. He sends them a judge, a deliverer, as Jocelyn pointed out to us. And again, 12 times, 12 judges, that pattern is repeated. God's people call out and God relents and gives them a deliverer, except for the last one, or at the end. And that points forward to the deliverer that God will send. Over and over again, God's people call out at their lowest point. No matter how low you sink, no matter how far you fall from God, how unlikely you think it might be that God can use you. Just look at Ehud and Samson and Jephthah and all of the other judges. If God can work with them, surely he can work with me. Surely he can work with you. Surely he can work with St. John's, with us, together as his people. Each judge, in a faint way, points us to Jesus. In Jesus, we see the full extent and result of human sin and evil. But in Jesus, it's not God's people who face the consequences, but it's God himself in Jesus who takes on the sin of the world and all of history on himself and absorbs that punishment for us, which is why we don't have to suffer the full consequences of our sin. Both Judges and Jesus teach us that God saves those who call to him and defeats those who don't. Well, this week we've been praying about the opportunities that God has given us, or the opportunities that God might give us at St. John's. And opportunities means, what do I mean? Means opportunities to tell this dying and suffering and rebellious world about the love and salvation that Jesus offers them, and to live that message ourselves. Opportunities to spread this message, to help people come to know Jesus. Following Jesus and spreading his message is costly, as the sin inside us is exposed. In this coming week, we're going to be looking at the cost. And as Judges kind of shows us all this yucky stuff, it's not much fun. As we call people to turn from their idols, as we ourselves turn from our idols to follow God. This week we're going to be thinking about what it's going to cost us to follow Jesus, to tell the world about Jesus.